few people have entered, and I think that they're all sort of texting on the Zoom chat already about which country they're on today. And those of you that have just started to join in, if you could keep doing that, that would be wonderful. Namaskaram, namaste. I'd like to acknowledge the Bunurong people and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I live and work on the lands of these people, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I also acknowledge the gods, goddesses, spirits, elders from my culture who are here with me. I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and we exist on stolen land. My name is Priya Srinivasan. I'm an independent artist and also the co-director of Sangam, the first performing arts festival of South Asia and diaspora in Australia. I'm originally from Tamil Nadu in South India, but I came to Naarm here from when I was quite young. More about me later, but in the meantime, here's just a few housekeeping notes for today's lunch. I'd like to thank Feral Arts for inviting Veronica and I to share some ideas today, and we've got wonderful Eleanor Jackson joining us as well. But just as a reminder for all of you that the lunch today is being recorded and will be live streamed and available for viewing afterwards on www.llol.com.au. We'll be sticking to the 30-minute time frame because of the sign language interpreters and captioners, and also everyone's time limits. If there's also live captioning, and if people click on the captions icon on Zoom, they can see that. There's also live Auslan. Thank you so much. On the left, can you see, can everyone see the Auslan? Yeah, okay, great. And if people who want to ask a question can type it in the Zoom chat or put your hand up on Zoom itself, and then we will try and address you whenever we get a minute. And in the meantime, if you can keep your mics muted unless you're speaking, that'd be great. If there are any technical problems or feedback, please contact on this following email, contact@artsfront.com. I think that's it. Was that it for all the housekeeping stuff? Great, thank you. I'm co-presenting today with the incredible powerhouse many of you know as Veronica Pardo, CEO of Multicultural Arts Victoria and former CEO of Arts Access, who stepped down from her position to make room for a leader that reflected the diversity of that institution. I'd like to ask Veronica to say a few words about herself and her practice and where she comes from.
Thanks, Priya. Thank you for that introduction. That's very complimentary. I'm Veronica Pardo. I'm the CEO of Multicultural Arts Victoria. I live and work on the lands of the Wurundjeri people from the Kulin Nation. And I also pay my respects to elders past, present, acknowledge that sovereignty has not been ceded and that this is and always has been Aboriginal land. Priya always insists that I introduce myself. I'm always very reluctant to do it. I've had this practice of kind of, sitting in the background of the work that I've been doing for a very long time, which is where I find myself most comfortable. But Priya is always insisting that, introduce yourself. People need to know who you are. So I will tell you that I am a migrant to this country. I came as a young girl. I hail from a small country called Uruguay, population 3 million, so very small. It is also a colonized country of European settlers, predominantly Spanish and Portuguese. So Spanish is my first language. The indigenous people of Uruguay are the Charrua, the Chana, Arachan, and Guarani. They are also, they've also been all but wiped out due to territorial occupation and war. So I stand in solidarity with all Indigenous peoples across the world and their collective struggle for reparations and Indigenous sovereignty.
Thank you, Veronica, for your introduction. Really appreciate it. And I mean, I would really like to now introduce the fabulous Eleanor Jackson, who we're so grateful can join us today. Eleanor Jackson is a Filipino-Australian artist, poet, performer, arts producer, and community radio broadcaster. She's the author of A Leaving, by Vagabond Press. Her live album, One Night Wonders, is produced by Going Down Swinging. She's a passionate advocate for diverse and inclusive cultures, and she is a former editor-in-chief and now chair of Peril magazine and vice chair of the Stella Prize. Eleanor, if you would like to speak a little bit about yourself and your practice before we begin asking you some questions today, that would be great.
Thanks, Priya, and it's lovely to be in such esteemed company. I can see a few different faces that I recognise and a few folks I'm sure are online. As you mentioned, I'm a poet and a performer and an arts producer, but I also, in my professional life, I suppose, work in sustainability and have a particular interest in cultural sustainability. So how we see not just arts products and arts industry, but art making and cultural experience as a part of our cultural understanding of what it means to value our intergenerational responsibilities across the board. So I feel like that that's my kind of right brain and left brain dialogue that I suppose I have all of the time. But concurrent to that, I suppose one of my greatest passions is to work with Asian Australian artists and producers, particularly through Peril, where I've been a part of the team there for the last 10 or so years.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. What a great introduction.
I just had a fear that Veronica, I was on mute that whole time. I was like, I'm on mute?
No. No, you were good. We were just wanting to, probably start by asking you what's been the impact of COVID-19 on your work and people that you're in touch with and at Peril, if you could speak a little bit about that.
I mean, Peril is predominantly an online publication, but even so, the impact has been meaningful for us. We review and engage with public arts events, and in this case, particularly Asia Topa, and I think the progressive impact upon that particular festival and now the overall shutdown of the arts sector has had an impact on our work. And while the bulk of our work is online, we also host exhibitions, we've cancelled events, we've had partners whose work is no longer, I guess, viable in the current circumstances. And we've had to really reorient the work that we do to not just reflect those changes and that impact across the arts sector as a whole, but also to really be cognizant of the fact that all of our team are predominantly volunteers, that they are arts workers generally speaking, but they cross-subsidise much of their work with Peril as a very small organisation. They cross-subsidise that work through other institutions, and those income streams are in many cases no longer there. So we're trying to take an attitude of really understanding not just our desire to continue our work, but to be really sensitive and thoughtful to our team as individuals and as members of communities. So they have, they're impacted as arts workers, they're impacted as a part of this holistic industry, they're impacted as individuals, but they're impacted as people who are family and friends and by and large connected to the Asian diaspora. And so their families are not necessarily close with them at this particular time. And so I think, we're really seeing that at a professional level, at a social and industry level, at a financial level, and then at the really personal level, that the impacts are quite wide reaching. And it's really hard to generalize, I suppose, how any one person is being affected at this time. And we're trying not to do that, I suppose.
Can I jump in there and say, I'm constantly sort of equivocating between feeling like I want to focus on kind of the compounding of disadvantage and how we might ameliorate some of that, but also recognizing the enormous strengths of these communities. And we, have been estranged in a sense from our families, our extended families, by virtue of our migration histories. So therefore, we're very skilled at maintaining connection over distance. And I that's something for some people who've had their families at their fingertips, in a sense, surrounding them in a kind of physical way. What do you think might be the opportunities for migrant and refugee families to actually, to teach, to actually lead in terms of how we maintain connection whilst we're apart? How do we how can we be together through these virtual spaces in a way that constructs family when we can't be together in the same room? Ella, I'm really keen to hear your reflections on that.
Look, and I agree, Veronica. I think that there's both a positive and a kind of more negative way to look at this sense of distance in this current time. And there are real wellsprings of strength and community vitality, which have been maintained notwithstanding distance for many communities over many generations. Do you know what I mean? Like, people still maintain really strong connections with cultural communities that are not physically proximate to them. And actually, at Peril, we often talk about being a part of a digital diaspora, that we are connecting with people who share ideas, who share values, who share lenses and intent, but they don't necessarily share lots of the geolocated components that we typically think of as the hallmarks of community. And so I would say too, yeah, there is definitely lots of resilience, and what we can learn is that, you know, you let your mum call you every time she wants to, and that's how you maintain connection. And then there are also, I think, ways where we could be talking about a different kind of empathy, where perhaps we understand better from mainstream communities what it means to be spatially distant from those who you love and bring meaning to your life. And so I think it's both learning from skills and capacities on one side, but also, you know, that's what we talk about all the time with empathy, but to be in the position of the other, to be isolated, to be without those networks, to require the generosity of the state or friends or community in order to build those things, shouldn't necessarily make us feel superior that we're not reliant on these things ordinarily, but instead more empathetic about what it means to need those all of the time. So I'd like to see both learning on both ways, without necessarily catastrophizing the whole situation and assuming that it's all negative and all deleterious.
So true.
Although I did want to say, I hear what you're saying, and both of you, and I completely agree with you. But I do want to bring up the ways in which this particular crisis has unearthed the more sort of racist elements of the ways it's affected people from Asia, especially from East Asia and even Southeast Asia. We're hearing reports every day of different kinds of, you know, attacks. And I'm just wondering if you can speak about that, because peril has been peril came into existence, and even the word peril is really speaking to the whole yellow peril that Australia has always thought it has dealt with. And so if you could talk a little bit about the idea of peril being really important right now for us to understand what some people of color are going through.
Oh, I can't tell. Just switch to you, Veronica. Were you about to say something?
No, go.
Priya, as I said, I don't think it's easy to generalize and to say it's all great and isn't it wonderful, we're so connected, we've got Zoom now, nor do I want to make it seem as if everybody is being subject to racist slurs in the street. But I think one of the things that crisis always does is that it exacerbates existing inequalities and that it then generates new ones. So, you know, in a kind of period of economic freefall, we, and by we I mean Australia, kind of mainstream normative Australia, has typically prioritised the state and those bodies or agents that fit within the state's understanding of what is legitimate and acceptable, and often that is really connected to individuated, masculinized economic capacities, which I think in Australia it would not be unjustified to say that those have been also intertwined with the colonial project and with an understanding of whiteness. So migrant bodies, less, I guess, less conforming bodies, and I don't just mean like the body, I mean like the person, those are often sidelined. And I think that in across all of Australia's history, but about the recurrence of a kind of xenophobic and anti-outsider rhetoric, which is ably deployed whenever there is a crisis. So our capacity to racially scapegoat when there is a period of foment or tension is still really deeply woven into Australia's national culture. And I think that's what we're really sadly seeing now when we see incidents of street violence against East Asians and others. We're seeing a return in fearfulness to blame the other, and the visible other in the Australian case is often migrants. And yeah, I mean, I don't find that situation to be anything other than heartbreaking. And unfortunately, to reinforce the idea of why peril continues to exist. I mean, often lots of folks talk about Asian Australians as a model minority, so a group of people who have had a certain kind of economic or social upwards mobility over a period of generations. But I've often really tried to counter that and say that cyclical racism is about undergirding values that the culture still holds about who is a legitimate and who is an illegitimate Australian and what they contribute. So this resurgence of current kind of street and social violence is unfortunately not surprising, and I think only galvanizes us further about why we exist and why we keep wanting to be a part of a more nuanced conversation.
And can I also just say, that's fantastic. Thank you, Eleanor, for that response. But can I also ask, what do you think are potential opportunities long-term that could come out of this crisis for us that could serve us in the future? Meaning, if we keep diversity at the core of this restructure, how do you think it might shape up from your perspective?
I guess I'm trying to be quite hopeful and to really understand that although this will be a period of broad reaching change, that some of that change may be productive and meaningful. We've been talking a bit about peril, about what we want to do, and I guess our first hope is to endure. And then also to sustain. So to think about what a really critical and conscious rebuilding of the Australian arts sector would be if we were to think about our communities, not just audiences, if we were to think about our methods of engagement as being beyond the capital. So what do we do to get people to buy more tickets and come to more stuff and make more art products? But to be a bit more about, I suppose, one of the foundational points of art, like the sense of art as a kind of foundational and paramount symbolic language of culture. And so for us, that's a bit more about seeing a hierarchy of values around rebuilding an arts sector to try and see how it can value cultural vitality, how it can think about social equity, where its environmental and ethical responsibilities lie. And underneath that is economic viability. But I think if we start the hierarchy by saying these are industries and businesses, they have been affected by this downturn, we need to reinstall their industry status so that it profits in ways that are either, I guess, reflective of the past or presumably a bit better, then I think that we will continue to see a sidelining of some of the broader issues, which are about every Australian's right to cultural expression and to the kinds of democratic participation that we actually see are enabled by the critical thinking, feeling and understanding skills that are a part of art and art making and art being in the world. So I do think that there are opportunities, but I don't want to be unnecessarily optimistic to say that those would be everybody's agendas. I think understandably in a vulnerable period economically, lots of sectors will want to try and work out how to get bums on seats. And I guess there is a hope that if we were to see a real flattening of the economic model across the arts, that we might then say, what do we need to reinvest in to make this a more socially equitable industry or sector, with some of those other values in mind, I suppose, around community and social capital, and the broader understanding of how arts contributes to our ethical conduct in the world.
Can I jump in there, Priya?
Thank you. Yes, please.
I think it's a brilliant response, Eleanor. And just before starting this session, we were having a conversation about this very thing around how do we reshape the narrative about what is the purpose of arts and culture that transcends the kind of limited thinking that currently prevails around what is this industry for. But I wonder if you could speak specifically to the literature sector, the writing sector. I'm reading in social media and other forms that it has been disproportionately hit by funding cuts, and it is a sector that I think is important to reflect on, particularly around the diversity issue, because I think so much has been happening within that sector to try to elevate the voices of diverse writers, to try to grapple with the inherent problematic nature of our overall industry in terms of replicating for cultural forms of whiteness. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in that sector right now, and how this may negatively or positively impact on some of the work that we've been trying to do around pivoting those, where the focus has been for writers?
I was like, aren't there 8 minutes left? Would you like to ask a kind of fundamental existential purpose of the entire literary sector? Look, I mean, I don't think it takes... what's the phrase? Do you mean this? Anybody could see that the literary sector is underfunded for do you mean there's an excess of supply and whatever? Do you mean? I hate when I use economic terms lightly and I clearly don't understand them. But either way, there's an asymmetry between the amount of cultural production that we have and the amount of funding that we have to support that cultural production. And I think that has... Yes, I love the performing arts and I love the way that the sociality of arts is really celebrated by that. But I think it's something that I've really seen in a kind of shift towards a very festivalized, public performance, outcomes-oriented form of art industry support, where we're about not just producing the art, but producing the circumstances for additional social consumption alongside the arts. And I think that one of the things that's really fundamental about literature is its durability and its permanence, and the beautiful ephemeral quality and the kind of moment in time work that we get from performance is also really vital. But I do think that as Australians in general, we have underinvested in the last however long in our own literary sector, sometimes due to the costs and the practical realities of what a publishing sector means, and also because of what access to global English literature has meant in an increasingly international field for that particular market. So I think there are lots and lots of different changes. And I would say it is actually a really great pity, because I would say that in the last 5 to 10 years, we have seen a real flourishing of diverse Australian voices. I think a willingness on behalf of the Australian community to look more compassionately back in at themselves, but also more critically at what those histories entail. And I think that that's a kind of truth telling that's long overdue, but also has benefits on both sides of the ledger. So not just for those who need to tell their truth, but for those who want to, I guess, move forward in a world that is based on that reality and that complexity. And I think that I don't have any kind of specific way out for it, but I would definitely say that, the sector as a whole is grossly underfunded. Literature continues to receive, I think, smaller than they do deserve portion of that, particularly to counter what global English arts consumption and literature looks like and the costs of books. But there is a deep value in learning to recognise our own voices, to ask ourselves to make those voices as complex and holistically representative of who we are, in order to be able to, I guess, build a better community that is founded on a kind of realistic and reality narrative about where we have been and where we want to go. I do mean there's a Filipino phrase by Jose Rizal, a bit like, he who does not know where he comes from will never get where he's going. And I think that Australia really really kind of typifies that some of our lostness for our own national narrative is about a deep desire for cultural erasure about our past and our histories.
That's fabulous, Eleanor. Thank you for that. We've got about 4 minutes left, and I'm wondering if there's anyone present today that has a burning question or comment that we could speak to. I know that, I don't know who wrote this from Feral Art. Great time to think about the future we want and what roles the arts play in that future. I think it's a really interesting question that we're asking. Again, back to our earlier question around what happens if we not only place the arts at the center of this economic recovery, but diversity at the heart of that. And by diversity, talking about the erasure that has happened with colonization, continued colonization, and then subsequent waves of immigration that have also complexified how we understand ourselves. Any takers? To solve all our problems.
Priya, I was going to add a little bit to
now.
that. I think one of the things that it's really interesting for me here in Australia when I talk to people about what culture means to them, in that people are very expressive and articulate about what professional arts practice looks like, but are often rendered incapable of describing what their cultural grounding and values and purpose is. And I do think that the way that we create a false hierarchy of professional practice, which sits above cultural belonging and expression and understanding, is a real inhibitor to us having a more diverse and inclusive arts sector. And by extension, a more diverse and inclusive culture. Do I mean that we separate and deculturate arts practice, and that we actually value a kind of cultural erasure in our multicultural assimilation, and that we try to enforce that kind of cultural assimilation for First Nations communities is really to the detriment of all of us, because to belong, to have a life of meaning, to see purpose and value in the things that you do make and create, and to have expressions for that feeling and value, they're things that make life fundamentally more worth living and make crisis fundamentally more manageable.
I think that's an amazing place to perhaps finish our conversation today. I can't think of a better way to leave this discussion than thinking about the way that art can create, and culture more broadly, as you're talking about, Eleanor, can create a way forward for us if we embrace it in its totality and in its more in a much more nuanced way. I know that there's a few announcements that are required today by Feral Arts about the forthcoming little lunches. So I might just hand over to Priya for my final words. But thank you, Eleanor, for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you.
And over to you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Eleanor and Veronica, both of you. These half an hours just doesn't feel like enough. We could just keep going on, but what a great place to end today. A couple of notes. Thursday's Little Lunch is now going to be a hot brown honey takeover hosted by the amazing Busty Beats. And on for the Friday Little Lunch, we'll meet about funding for independent artists, and in particular, how to grow the Australia Council Resilience Fund to a viable level, picking up from yesterday's questions and comments that happened, and the details will all be available on the Little Lunch website. Thank you again to Feral Arts and Arts Front for creating these platforms. We really appreciate being in conversation with all of you. Thank you so much.